Geopolitics is causing the world to change very rapidly, and this is all happening at a time when technology has accelerated the use of artificial intelligence on the battlefield. More than a decade ago, I started working with some of the preeminent defense thinkers in the West. General John Allen, four-star Marine General, Deputy Secretary of Defense Bob Work, August Cole, Paul Shari, and others, and started to investigate the idea of the application of artificial intelligence in the field of battle. And we came up with the concept. General Allen and I wrote an initial piece in the Journal of the US Naval Institute, Proceedings Journal, and we labeled our article, our initial paper, Hyperwar. The idea behind Hyperwar, of course, is that the application of artificial intelligence will shrink the decision making, the force orientation, and the actual time required to take kinetic action, what is called the OODA loop, the observe, orient, decide, and act loop. And with this time being squeezed out of the OODA loop, where once human decision making was the cause for delay and created a natural lag in between these phases of the observe, orient, decide, and act phase, now all of that time is being essentially sucked out of the OODA loop with automation, with artificial intelligence, collapsing the OODA loop, making actions very, very rapid, making escalation potentially very rapid, making action and counteraction very rapid. And in doing so, it also creates the potential for where one of the belligerents that might not have the most sophisticated weaponry, but if they master hyperwar, they master the activities and the capabilities and the technologies that allow them to squeeze time out of the OODA loop, they can act much faster, they can see much faster, they can decide much faster, and it won't really matter whether their enemy has more powerful kinetic weapon systems, because the enemy potentially doesn't even get an opportunity to use those systems. So with that being said, I wanted to create a short series of videos where I would go through a few chapters of this book that, again, is based on concepts that we started developing a decade ago. And this book that you see here, which is available from numerous places online, is now 8 years old. It was written in 2017, published in 2018. But many of the concepts in this book are related to events that have happened since, and so many of the ideas that we proposed have come to fruition, and others are still glimpses into the future. So by no means is the fact that this book was written 8 or 10 years ago really taking away from the value that one gets in investigating some of these ideas. So let's, without further ado, get into some of what those ideas are. In the first chapter, what I would say the most important points are right here, these 6 key implications of hyperwar. What are they? Let me explain those. So first of all, because you now have autonomy and you are no longer as reliant on large force structures and large numbers of humans taking every action, then you have the ability to enable a small force to do many very impressive, very powerful things in the battlefield. So the implication of this is that small, rich countries who want to project power, that have great power ambition, will start to significantly shape geopolitics. Over the last decade, you've noticed how certain countries in the Middle East that are rich but have traditionally not had very large militaries have begun to project power well beyond their borders. And this is a trend that will only continue, because as more technological adoption, more artificial intelligence usage seeps into those decision-making structures and those militaries, the ability for those countries to project force at distance will actually increase without them needing to field very large forces. The second point that I want to get across is that autonomy enables asymmetric strategies in a way that hardly anything else does. You've seen in Ukraine, as an example, small FPVs, let's say $200, $300, $500 FPVs being flown into quadcopters, being flown into a gunship helicopter that might cost $20 million or $30 million and actually destroy them. Now, that is being done with human control, but with this extremely inexpensive, essentially microcontroller stabilized system called a quad rotor UAS, or an unmanned aerial system. But now, if you think about what happens when these systems are deployed at scale as swarms, with the cameras on these systems being controlled by AI, and a swarm of these flying into an approaching group of gunships, you can see what that will result in. It'll result in a few hundred, a few $1,000s of systems of weaponry, essentially undoing platforms that have taken hundreds of millions of dollars or billions of dollars to put together. And this asymmetry is going to show up everywhere in the battlefield. And people that figure out how to use autonomy to master asymmetry will be winners. Those who don't will be losers. The third implication is that regional powers that are afforded protection by nuclear umbrellas will have great freedom of action. And you've seen this with the recent war, May 2025 war between India and Pakistan, where both powers were protected by nuclear umbrellas. And because of autonomy, they were able to do things which traditionally they would not have been able to do. Cruise missiles powered with autonomy. The loitering munitions powered with autonomy. And in many cases, even the more sophisticated missiles fired from aircraft, including air-to-air missiles, take over essentially with on-board or on-edge intelligence and are able to guide themselves. All of these systems can be thought of as autonomous systems, semi-autonomous systems, and they have afforded their users the ability to fight a war without even crossing the border, while both countries were protected by their nuclear umbrella, creating great freedom of action. They were able to do many things that maybe in a war 20 years ago they would not have done. The fourth implication is that peer competitors with large aging conventional forces will be able to use autonomy and artificial intelligence and the infusion of sensors to very effectively modernize their assets at very low cost. I would say that the country that is doing this to the greatest extent is actually Russia today. Now, Ukraine is doing this as well, but I would not call them a grade A peer competitor. Obviously, I would say that Russia, and which lags, but then China and the US are really in that group. But Russia has been able to take Soviet-era stocks of tanks, of other kind of platforms, of aircraft, and has been able to infuse them with intelligence. They've been able to take their FAB bombs and make them into smart munitions, smart weapons. This is just a small example, but they've also been able to adapt, for example, target drones and make them high-speed cruise missiles with, again, autonomy in the system. They've been able to build very, very low-cost loitering munitions with essentially off-the-shelf, sometimes even commercial-level parts. So at low cost, they've been able to take a large aging conventional force and really bring it into the 21st century, into the age of hyperwar. And this process obviously has not ended. When you think of counter-drone action, when you think of how some of these technologies are being baked into tanks and armored vehicles and many other platforms, including naval platforms, this is just the beginning, and a lot more will happen. But those who are able to effectively leverage autonomy and intelligence and sensors to upgrade what they already have will obviously have a leg up. The fifth concept is around the assurance and expectation of privacy, which in the age of AI and sensors and monitoring has collapsed. And what this implies really in the military context is that multi-domain warfare, so your traditional domains of air, land, sea, subsea, and now space, have been further enhanced with the cognitive domain, the information domain, the cyber domain. And in all of these areas, you can essentially use artificial intelligence to act at all times. In the cyber domain, it can be used to create attacks, to constantly scan networks, to constantly try and infiltrate autonomously. You can use artificial intelligence in the information domain, also autonomously and at scale. And these activities are now contributing to an always on war. My belief is that we are now in an always on war that is being waged in different domains at all times. One of the reasons for this is, of course, the fact that the world is undergoing a huge shift and moving into a new era. If you look at what Ray Dalio has talked about or what Peter Turchin has talked about, you can see that these cyclical movements and the shift of power from west to east, which is happening, is one of the reasons why there is a period of confrontation and a period of tension. But in this period of confrontation, there is also an always on war that is waging sometimes at low intensity, but always using autonomous techniques to the extent that the practitioner or the actor involved has mastery over those techniques. And then finally, what I would say is that an increased level of risk tolerance is brewing because you can tolerate the losses of autonomous platforms where you wouldn't have tolerated the loss of a pilot or an infantryman. And again, taking the example of the May 2025 conflict between Pakistan and India, you had 100 plus aircraft in the sky, never crossing borders, beyond visual range, missiles being launched from both sides. And in the case of the PL-15, which was being used from the Pakistani side, downing multiple aircraft that all fell on Indian territory. So there was no risk of the Indians fielding their aircraft and, let's say, having a pilot captured, as was the case in 2019. And because you can avoid some of these instances, you can use, in the case of Pakistan, using MLRS systems. In the both cases of India and Pakistan, using autonomous loitering munitions and drones, and then in the Indian case, also using cruise missiles. You have this collection of autonomous systems that are going at each other where no soldier has actually even crossed the border. So in some senses, this creates this idea of risk tolerance because you don't have to be sending troops or pilots over an actual target and then risking shoot down and capture. And of course, in this chapter, then we go into great depth and we talk about individual weapon systems. We talk about cases of countries from Saudi Arabia to North Korea. We talk about, things that have been done in the past in terms of upgrading conventional militaries. We talk about, of course, this idea of containing human loss and enabling war. But what I would say the most important takeaway really is that the use of autonomy doesn't just mean smarter weapons, better weapons. The use of autonomy really reshapes how wars are fought and the risks that politicians calculate relative to the conduct of war. And also, in many cases, this idea of the intelligence that it takes to engineer an attack is now free. The domains of war have expanded. Some of these are virtual domains. There is no incentive to not fight, particularly in an age where the entire global structure, the geopolitical structure is changing. So because of all of this, what I would say is that the takeaways from this first chapter of Hyperwar are that autonomy goes far beyond just smarter weapons. It reshapes how wars are fought. It accelerates the decision-making cycle and ultimately will create, and this is a theme that we'll revisit in this book, and ultimately will create incentives for humans to be removed from the loop. Thank you very much.